It it continues to be a dangerous place, and it was a dangerous place then.
And they had to decide, like, do we stay or do we leave,
Geopolitically, the United States was very concerned about communism in Central and South America.
He very much took seriously like his faith, reading the Gospels, but then reading the Gospels and kind of living out that faith in the context in which he found himself.
The United States gave more money to El Salvador in the 1980s under the Reagan administration than any other country in aid except Egypt and Israel. The next greatest amount of US wealth was directed externally at this little country of El Salvador. Why?
Because historically in El Salvador, there was this kind of unison of the families who owned most of the wealth, the church, and politics and government and military.
El Salvador was run by oligarchs and generals. There was a lot of extreme poverty and peasants. The fear of the United States was that civil unrest, the revolt of the poor over the powerful interest in a country like El Salvador, could lead to those poor adopting socialist or communist ideologies.
Like, we invested heavily in, there were periods where we were given like $1 million a day to, kind of back the Salvadoran government, military. Even like the day before, the 1 or 2 days before the killings of the Jesuits, that same battalion was being trained by the Green Beret in La Libertad. So, and how to use night vision and all this stuff.
In El Salvador, one of the most brutal and violent days in 10 years of war. While rebels and government troops continued fighting for control of the capital city of San Salvador, a group of armed men entered a university there and brutally murdered 8 people, including 6 Jesuit priests.
The government immediately accused leftist rebels of being the murderers, but strong circumstantial evidence suggests they were from El Salvador's extreme right wing.
The killing of Rutilio, and then many other priests. Monsignor just got more and more kind of convinced that he had to take on an active role to speak out on behalf of truth and justice, and that ultimately led, to his killing.
En un momento dado, Monseñor se prepara para hacer la consagración de la hostia y levanta las manos y en eso se oye un disparo.
When he too was murdered by right-wing gunmen, for liberation Christians everywhere, his name became synonymous with a clear commitment to the oppressed. He was enshrined, in his own words, as the voice of those without a voice, the voice of the peasants of Latin America.
Muchos no lo querían por eso, porque he was a man that loved peace. Many people loved him in the community. He was on the side of the people. He tried to stay out of political sides, but it was tough for him because they didn't want him helping the people. He just cared about peace and love for the community.
You could literally go to the market and do all of your shopping, and they would have Monsignor's homily going full blast on all the radios. So people really tuned in. Those homilies were really where they would get a lot of their information as to like what was happening.
The country's civil war, which started in 1979, pitted the military-led government against left-wing guerrilla groups. Thousands who spoke out against the government on immigration and land reform issues simply disappeared.
The story that history textbooks are going to tell is the fall of communism and the U.S. winning the Cold War. But they're not necessarily going to talk about the cost, who paid the price for that.
On the concrete steps of the cathedral in San Salvador, the military decreed that demonstrators for human rights should be discouraged. Nothing very new for El Salvador.
There are thousands of El Salvadorians who disappeared. Nobody ever knows what happened to them. They were speaking out, perhaps motivated by a sermon that Romero gave, perhaps motivated by something they had learned at the UCA from the Jesuit priests. And they spoke out, and someone visited them in the middle of the night or stopped them on the road. And they're because they weren't American, nobody followed up. Nobody knows where they are. They're in some unmarked grave somewhere. A year after Romero's murder, and shortly after the murder of the churchwomen, there's a village called Mazot, or El Mazot, where about 1,000 people, it's surrounded by paramilitary group, the right-wing death squads is what I would call them. They kill the civilians in the village. They kill about 800 to 1,000 people. They kill so many that it's not actually known how many people, because they put them in mass unmarked graves, and many of them were children.
Yes.
You want to talk about undocumented history makers who are not going to be in textbooks.
People will tell you stories about, like, just carrying a Bible around, you were like subject to, being labeled as a subversive.
Unfortunately, the country has always had violence. Before the Civil War, during, and after. There's always been violence. There's always been corruption.
You could see that the Jesuit educators there, the Jesuits, but also the young lay teachers, were moved by what was happening in El Salvador and the martyrdom that had taken place.
Thankfully to Pope Francis, he really opened the way. He was beatified, and now we have Saint Romero, which is a big deal. It's a big deal for the country, because there were a lot of bishops who were blocking, they were not in agreement with Monsignor Romero.
Being concerned with the poor and having social justice classes. It really began after the martyrs. That's stuff that we're involved in now, but El Salvador, those people are still living in hellish poverty.
If you do get a job, the pay is minimal. It's $200 American money a month. Per day, the most a person like us could earn is only $5 a day. What can you do with $5? The meat, when I left, was $5 a pound. Well, what are you going to do with that if you have a family of 4 to feed? It's very difficult.
We took in a lot of refugees. Yeah. And then we had a change in presidential administrations. He wanted to deport the people back to El Salvador, even though it was violent and dangerous and impoverished.
The gang started in the United States, mostly in LA. And when Salvadorans were fleeing during the Civil War, many of them went to LA. And as a positioning thing, like, these young Salvadorans, kind of as a defensive measure, formed, two of the gangs that continue on today in Salvador. In 2015, we did have the highest homicide rate out of any country not at war. That number has come down quite a bit.
If Romero was here, he would say, focus less on me and focus less on all those poor people, because El Salvador today still has one of the highest homicide rates in the world. For all the death and for all the social justice movements that began in the United States because of the martyrs, campus ministry programs like ones at Xavier and like the one I was talking about at St. Peter's Prep really gained momentum after. That's when social justice started in our schools.
But I do think that, particularly for young people, what's really important is that we create spaces and we place ourselves in the path of those on the margins.